The crowd did not cheer. That was the first thing people noticed. And in Paris in the summer of 1794, a crowd that did not cheer at an execution was something that had never happened before. By July of that year, the guillotine had been operating in the French capital for nearly 2 years. What had begun as a tool of revolutionary justice, swift, egalitarian, cleaner than the axe or the rope, had become something else entirely. It had become entertainment. Parisians had developed habits around it, the way they developed habits around the theatre or the market. They knew which days produced the most interesting victims. They knew the executioner's name. They knew the route the carts took through the streets, and they positioned themselves along it in advance to get a good view. Street vendors had learned to station themselves near the scaffold. You could buy lemonade while you watched a man lose his head. You could buy pamphlets listing the days condemned, the way you might buy a program before a performance. The revolution had industrialized death so completely, so efficiently, that killing had lost its weight. It had become administrative, routine. The revolutionary tribunal processed cases the way a mill processes grain, steadily, without sentiment, in whatever quantity was required. The public prosecutor, Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, had sent more than 2,000 people to the guillotine by that summer. On busy days he processed 30 cases before noon. He was not a monster in the conventional sense. He was something more disturbing, a bureaucrat who had simply accepted that this was his job, and done it well. Into this machinery, on July 17, 1794, came 16 women. They were Carmelite nuns from the monastery at Compiègne, a town north of Paris that most Parisians knew only as a place the royal family had once favored for hunting. They ranged in age from 29 to 78. They had been convicted that same morning on charges of counter-revolutionary fanaticism, which, when the prosecutor was pressed to define it precisely in open court, turned out to mean simply that they believed in God and had continued to practice their faith after the state ordered them to stop. They were loaded into the wooden carts that served as the revolution's transport for the condemned. Their hands were bound behind their backs. The carts began moving through the streets of Paris toward the scaffold, and they began to sing. What happened over the next 2 to 3 hours, the length of the journey from the Conciergerie prison to the Place du Trône Renversé in eastern Paris, is one of the most thoroughly documented and least explicable events of the entire revolutionary period. Crowds that had cheered at hundreds of executions fell silent. People who had come specifically to jeer stood still with their mouths closed. Some removed their hats. Some wept openly. The streets of Paris, which had roared with celebration through years of daily killing, went quiet for 16 women in brown wool robes singing ancient hymns from the backs of manure carts. To understand why this moment mattered, why it still matters, you need to go back 4 years, to the beginning of what the revolution did to religious life in France, and to the particular community of women who refused to accept it. The Carmelite order had existed in France for centuries. It was a contemplative order, meaning its members did not run schools or hospitals or orphanages in the way that other religious communities did. They prayed. That was their primary occupation, and their primary contribution to the world they inhabited. They rose in the middle of the night to pray. They prayed through the hours of the day in a rhythm that organized their entire existence. Their monastery at Compiègne had been established in 1641, and the community there had maintained that rhythm without interruption for 150 years, through wars and famines, and the long, slow transformation of French society that preceded the revolution. Then the revolution arrived and decided that prayer was a crime. In 1790, the National Constituent Assembly abolished all religious orders in France. Every monastery, every convent, every community of men and women who had organized their lives around religious vows was declared dissolved. The vows themselves were declared legally null, as if the state could reach inside a person's conscience and erase what was written there. Members of religious communities were given civilian clothes, a small pension, and instructions to go live ordinary lives as French citizens. The 20 sisters of the Carmelite community at Compiègne received these instructions. They looked at each other, and they made a different decision. They would not scatter, they would not pretend to be something they were not. They would find a way to continue living as what they were, within whatever constraints the revolution imposed, for as long as they possibly could. What they devised was a kind of double life that required extraordinary discipline and extraordinary courage to maintain. They divided into 4 small groups of 4 or 5 sisters each. Each group rented a modest apartment in a different part of Compiègne, presenting themselves to neighbors as ordinary civilian women, seamstresses perhaps, or women of modest independent means. They dressed in civilian clothing. They did not advertise their identities or their purposes. But every morning, before the town fully woke, they gathered at a local church, where a Jesuit priest named Father Delage de Locus, himself operating in disguise, himself taking an enormous personal risk, celebrated Mass for them. And in their separate apartments, in the evenings, they maintained the prayer schedule that had structured every day of their religious lives, the liturgy of the hours, the contemplative practices of the Carmelite tradition, the interior life that the revolution had declared did not exist and could not be permitted. They had 1 set of civilian clothes each. This was not a choice made for simplicity or spiritual austerity. It was the consequence of poverty. They could not afford more. Mother Thérèse of Saint Augustin led this community through those months. She had been born Madeleine Claudine Ledoine, the daughter of a Paris merchant, and she had entered religious life as a young woman and risen to become prioress through a combination of genuine spiritual depth and the kind of practical intelligence that keeps communities alive under pressure. She was not a mystic in the dramatic sense. She was something more useful, a woman who could look at an impossible situation and find the action most likely to preserve what mattered. Among her community were women of remarkable variety. Mother Henriette of Jesus had been born into one of the most distinguished families in France. She was the great niece of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Louis XIV's famous finance minister, the man who had essentially built the administrative apparatus of the French monarchy. Her family connections represented exactly the kind of aristocratic entanglement the revolution most despised. Sister Constance was 29 years old, the youngest member of the community, a woman who had entered religious life as a teenager and had known no other adult existence. At the other end of the age spectrum was Sister Mary of Jesus Crucified, 78 years old, who had entered the Carmelites as a young woman in the reign of Louis XV and had lived through more French history than most people could remember. They came from nobility, and from the merchant class, and from ordinary working families. What united them was not background or education, or social standing. What united them was a conviction that the revolution could not reach, the belief that their lives had a shape and a purpose, that no assembly and no tribunal, and no law of 22 prairial, could legislate away. That conviction was precisely what the Committee of Public Safety had decided it could not tolerate. On June 21, 1794, agents of the Committee of Surveillance moved on all 4 apartments simultaneously. The coordination was deliberate. Simultaneous raids ensured that no group could warn the others. The agents tore through the sisters' meager possessions with the systematic thoroughness of people who knew exactly what they were looking for. They found it: a portrait of King Louis XVI, a prayer to the Sacred Heart of Jesus that petitioned for the king's protection. These objects constituted proof of 2 things. The revolutionary authorities needed to demonstrate that the women had maintained a royalist sympathy and that they had continued living as a religious community, despite the explicit legal prohibition against doing so. Arrest warrants arrived the following morning. 16 sisters were taken into custody. 3 who happened to be visiting family members that day escaped the raids entirely and would survive the revolution. The 16 who were arrested were transported to a former convent that had been converted into a makeshift detention facility. They found themselves sharing the space with 17 English Benedictine nuns, who had been operating a school in Paris and had been arrested some months earlier. The 2 communities occupied the same confined space, prayed together, waited together. They waited 20 days. Then on July 12th, the mayor of Compiègne arrived with soldiers and a transport order. The nuns were being taken to Paris for trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal. There was an immediate practical problem. The sisters' only civilian clothes were in washtubs, soaking in water. They were not ready to wear. The mayor looked at his transport schedule, which could not be delayed, and made a decision that would turn out to be historically significant in a way he could not have anticipated. The nuns would travel to Paris, wearing their habits, the outlawed brown wool robes and white veils of the Carmelite order, the garments they were legally prohibited from wearing in public. They arrived at the Conciergerie prison in Paris that same evening, visibly, unmistakably, unapologetically, Carmelite nuns. The Conciergerie had been many things in its long history: a royal palace, an administrative center, a court of law. By 1794 it had become something simpler and more terrible, the last address of the condemned. Most prisoners arrived there and were gone within 48 hours, processed through the tribunal and out to the scaffold, with the same efficiency that characterized everything about the Terror's administrative apparatus. The building sat on the Ile de la Cité in the middle of the Seine, and its damp stone cells held at any given moment dozens of people who had already effectively ceased to exist in any meaningful legal or social sense. They were simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up with the fact of their deaths. The 16 nuns from Compiègne spent 5 days there, 5 days in which they understood completely what was coming, and in which they did something that requires examination. They renounced the civic oath they had been forced to take years earlier, the oath of allegiance to the revolutionary government that had been imposed on clergy and members of religious communities as a condition of their continued residence in France. This renunciation was not a legal or political act in any practical sense. It would help them in no court, it would impress no tribunal. It was purely an interior act, a clarification of conscience, a decision to arrive at judgment with their accounts settled according to the moral framework that had organized their entire lives, rather than the political framework that was about to end those lives. And Mother Thérèse sewed. Among all the details that survive from those 5 days in the Conciergerie, this one is perhaps the most quietly devastating. Using scraps of cloth that she begged or found or somehow obtained in that prison, she cut and stitched 16 small white caps, one for each of her sisters. The purpose was specific and practical. She knew from the public nature of the executions, she knew from the way the revolution had made death a spectator sport, that before the blade fell, the executioner's assistants would cut away the victim's hair to expose the back of the neck, and that this cutting was done roughly, efficiently, without consideration for the person it was happening to. The caps would spare her daughters that particular indignity. They would cover the heads the executioners would otherwise have to manhandle. They were a mother's last gift to her children, the protection of dignity in a place designed to strip it away entirely. On the morning of July 17th, the 16 women were led before the Revolutionary Tribunal. The courtroom, if you can call it that, was a chamber in the Palais de Justice. The Revolutionary Tribunal had been operating since March of 1793, and by July of 1794, it had arrived at a place of almost perfect procedural emptiness. The law of 22 Prairial, passed 6 weeks earlier at Robespierre's initiative, had eliminated the last elements that might have been mistaken for legal process. There was no defense counsel, there were no witnesses for the accused. Evidence in the conventional sense was not required. The jury could convict on the basis of what the law called moral certainty, a phrase that in practice meant political necessity. There were only 2 possible verdicts: acquittal or death. Fouquier-Tinville presided with the flat efficiency that had come to characterize him. He had grown up poor, had fought his way to legal education and professional standing, and had found in the Revolutionary Tribunal a position that matched his particular combination of legal precision and moral vacancy. He was not sadistic, he was not ideological in any deep sense. He was a man who had been given a job and had decided that doing it well was all that was required of him. By July of 1794, doing it well meant processing 16 women from Compiègne in less than a morning. The charges were read: counter-revolutionary fanaticism, maintaining illegal religious gatherings, refusing to embrace Republican values, harboring royalist sympathies, as evidenced by the portrait and the prayer found in their apartments. Sister Mary Henriette asked the prosecutor to define fanaticism. She said she did not understand the word. It was a tactical move, entirely transparent as a tactical move, and it succeeded in forcing Fouquier-Tinville to state plainly for the record that the fanaticism in question consisted entirely of the defendants' religious beliefs, that their crime was, in his precise legal formulation, that those beliefs made them criminals and annihilators of public freedom. Mother Therese stood before the tribunal and attempted to do what she had attempted to do in every difficult moment of the previous 4 years. She tried to take everything onto herself. She claimed full personal responsibility for every decision the community had made. She defended each of her sisters individually and specifically. She argued for their innocence with the intelligence and composure of someone who knows the argument will not succeed but makes it anyway, because some things need to be said regardless of outcome. It made no difference. The verdict had been determined before they entered the room. All 16 were condemned to death by guillotine. The sentence would be carried out that same afternoon. Between conviction and execution, the nuns were permitted a single request. They asked for a pail of hot water. With it they washed the civilian clothes they had been wearing. Then they put their habits back on, the brown wool robes, the white veils, the garments that had been outlawed, that had gotten them arrested, that would now be the clothes they died in. They had made their choice about what they were, and they would be that thing until the end. The tumbrils waited in the courtyard of the conciergerie, the wooden two-wheeled carts that had been designed for hauling manure and had been repurposed by the revolution into instruments of final transportation. The executioner maintained a fleet of 8 to 10 of them, specifically for this purpose. Most were unpainted raw timber. Some, for particularly significant prisoners, were painted red, as if their blood needed advertising before it was shed. The prison bell rang. Guards bound the sisters' hands behind their backs with rope. Then each of the 16 women climbed into the carts without assistance, without resistance, without any of the weeping and struggling and desperate last appeals that the guards who worked this courtyard had learned to manage as a matter of routine. They arranged themselves on the hard wooden benches. Their habits settled around them. They were ready. The carts moved through the prison gates and into Paris. The route from the conciergerie to the Place du Trône Renversé covered roughly 3 miles through the densest, most populated parts of the city. It was designed to take 2 to 3 hours, not because the distance required it, but because the revolution required it. Executions were public theater, and the slow procession through the streets was part of the performance. Crowds gathered along the route specifically to participate. They jeered at the condemned, threw refuse, screamed insults, spit on the carts as they passed. The condemned were expected to be terrified, or defiant in a broken way, or pleading, any of the human responses to imminent death that the crowd had learned to feed on over 2 years of daily spectacle. The nuns gave them none of that. Instead, somewhere in the first minutes of that journey through the streets of Paris, the 16 women began to sing. They started with the Missouri, the 51st Psalm, one of the oldest prayers in the tradition of Western Christianity, a song of repentance and supplication that had been sung in every Carmelite monastery, in every country in Europe for centuries. Then they moved into the office of readings, the formal liturgical prayers they had recited together every single day for years in their monastery, the prayers they had continued reciting in secret in their rented Compiègne apartments, the prayers that had organized every day of their religious lives, and that they now carried with them on a manure cart through the streets of revolutionary Paris. Then came the Salve Regina, the ancient hymn to the Virgin Mary, one of the defining devotional texts of Carmelite spirituality, a song so deeply embedded in their communal identity that they could sing it without thinking, without effort, the way a person breathes. Their voices were not trained voices in the concert sense. They were not performing. They were praying in the only way they knew how to pray, which was together, in the rhythms that had shaped every hour of their adult lives, in the presence of whatever was coming next. The crowd along the route had gathered to do what Paris crowds had been doing for 2 years. They had gathered to participate in the ritual of revolutionary justice, to witness the punishment of enemies of the state, to feel the collective satisfaction of a society purging what it considered its corruption. Instead, they went quiet. Contemporary accounts from multiple independent witnesses describe the same phenomenon, a silence settling over the streets as the carts passed that no previous execution procession had produced. People who had been shouting fell still. The usual roar of the Paris crowds, that constant background noise that visitors to the city always remarked upon, the living proof of a million lives being lived in close proximity, diminished as the singing passed through it. The way a stone thrown into moving water creates a stillness around itself. Some onlookers were seen removing their hats. Some wept. Some accounts describe people making the sign of the cross, a gesture that was technically illegal under the de-Christianization policies of the Revolution, a gesture that carried its own small risk in the summer of 1794, performing it anyway as the carts went by. The nuns sang the Office of the Dead as they moved through the streets, prayers specifically composed for those who have died, prayers asking for mercy and peace for the souls of the departed. They were singing these prayers for the more than 1,000 people who had already been guillotined at the Place du Trône Renversé before them. They were singing for the victims of the terror collectively, for every cart that had made this journey before theirs, for every voice that had fallen silent on that scaffold. They were praying for France itself, for the country that was doing this to them, in the ancient incomprehensible Christian pattern of praying for those who persecute you. Paris, for those 2 to 3 hours, fell silent and listened. The scaffold at the Place du Trône Renversé stood approximately 15 feet high, constructed from heavy timber, with stairs ascending the back, and an open platform surrounded by railings on 3 sides. The guillotine apparatus itself consisted of 2 upright wooden posts, set 15 inches apart, with metal-lined grooves running their full height, allowing the blade, attached to a weighted iron block called the mouton, that added 66 pounds of downward force, to fall freely and with absolute consistency. At the base of the apparatus was the bascule, a bench-like plank that tilted forward to bring the condemned person's body into horizontal position, and the lunette, the wooden yoke with a semicircular cutout that secured the neck precisely in the blade's path. On one side of the scaffold stood large baskets painted red. Their purpose was not decorative. The entire process, from the moment a person stepped onto the scaffold to the moment the blade completed its work, took less than a minute when Sanson and his assistants were working efficiently. The machinery was very good at what it was designed to do. The carts arrived at the Place du Trône Renversé in the late afternoon. The nuns descended from the tumbrils still singing. 24 other condemned prisoners were present that day, people convicted of various crimes against the revolution, who would also die that afternoon. But what was about to happen involved only the 16 women in brown robes. They formed a line before the scaffold. Mother Thérèse stood at the front of the line, holding the small ceramic statuette of the Virgin Mary that she had carried with her through the Conciergerie, through the tribunal, through the cart ride across Paris. It was no larger than her hand. One by one, each of her sisters approached her. Each knelt in the dirt before the scaffold. Each kissed the statuette, and each spoke the formal phrase that Carmelite sisters had been taught to speak since the earliest days of the order, the phrase requesting permission from their prioress before undertaking any significant act. "Permission to die, Mother." And Mother Thérèse looked at each face, the face of each woman she had led through 4 years of hiding, each woman she had dressed in civilian clothes and coached in the behavior of ordinary French citizens, each woman for whom she had sewn one of the 16 white caps, now covering their heads, and she gave each one her blessing, and she said each time to each daughter, "Go, my daughter." The executioner's assistants stood at the base of the scaffold steps. They did not interrupt. Whether this represented a professional accommodation, or something else, something that even these men, who had grown immune through routine to whatever happened in that place, found they could not bring themselves to violate, the historical record does not say. The prayers for the dying were completed before anyone moved toward the stairs. Sister Constance went first. She was 29 years old. She had entered Carmelite life as a teenager and had no adult memories that did not include this community, these prayers, these women. Contemporary accounts written by people who were present in that square that afternoon, describe her waving aside the executioner and his assistants, climbing the scaffold stairs, entirely unassisted, arriving at the top of the platform, and renewing her religious vows in a clear voice, loud enough for her sisters below to hear every word. Then she positioned herself on the bascule, without assistance. The assistants secured the lunette around her neck. The executioner released the catch. The blade fell. Then the next sister climbed the stairs. 16 voices became 15. The hymn continued. 15 voices became 14. Still the singing continued, diminished but unbroken, the surviving voices filling in the spaces left by the ones that had gone silent. 14 became 13. 13 became 12. Each time the blade fell, the sound coming from the base of the scaffold was quieter. Each time, the remaining voices adjusted, continued, refused to stop. The crowd in that square, which had watched more than 1,300 executions in the previous 6 weeks, stood in silence and counted the voices disappearing. Sister Mary of Jesus Crucified was among the last of the older sisters to ascend. She was 78 years old. She had entered the Carmelite order in the reign of Louis XV, before most of the people in that square had been born. She had lived through the entire arc of the old France and the violent birth of the new one, and she had arrived at this scaffold with 78 years of a life organized around the proposition that death was not the worst thing that could happen to a person. Before she climbed the stairs, she turned to the executioner's assistants, the men who had been managing the mechanics of state killing every day for months, who had become through repetition almost interchangeable with the machine they served, and she spoke to them directly. Her words were recorded by witnesses. "I forgive you, my friends. I forgive you with all that longing of heart, with which I would that God forgive me." Then she climbed the steps. The blade fell. Mother Therese of Saint Augustine was the last. She had watched 15 of her daughters go up those stairs and not come down. She had said, "Go, my daughter," 15 times. She had held the statuette of the Virgin for 15 pairs of lips to kiss. She had given 15 final blessings. She stood alone now at the base of the scaffold, the last person remaining from the community she had led and protected and served for 4 years of impossible circumstances. Every account that survived from people who were present that day agrees on one thing: she climbed those stairs with complete composure. She renewed her vows at the top in a clear voice. She positioned herself on the bascule without hesitation or assistance. She did not close her eyes. The blade fell for the 16th and final time. The singing stopped. The square was silent. The bodies of all 16 nuns were thrown into the mass grave that had been receiving the victims of the Place du Trône renversé since June. They were buried with the other 24 people executed that afternoon, and with the more than 1,300 who had preceded them, in the earth beneath what is now one of the busiest traffic intersections in eastern Paris. 10 days later, on July 27, 1794, in the French Revolutionary calendar, the 9th of Thermidor, the date that would give its name to the entire political moment, the National Convention turned on Maximilien Robespierre. The sequence of events moved with a speed that surprised everyone, including the participants. Robespierre attempted to speak on the floor of the convention, and was shouted down, an experience he had never encountered, because for more than a year no one had dared. He was arrested that evening. That night, in the Hotel de Ville where he had taken refuge, he was shot, either by his own hand or by an agent of the convention, depending on which account you accept, and the bullet shattered his jaw without killing him. He was guillotined the following afternoon, along with 21 of his closest associates, unable to speak because of his wound, the bandages around his face soaked with blood. The reign of terror ended. The Revolutionary Tribunal was dismantled within weeks. The rate of executions fell from dozens per day to almost nothing. The law of 22 prairial was repealed. The surviving prisoners of the Conciergerie were released. The great machinery of revolutionary death, the apparatus that had processed more than 17,000 official executions across France, and an estimated 10,000 more deaths in prisons, summary killings, ground to a halt. Many French Catholics believed then, and many believe now, that the deaths of the 16 Carmelites had caused this, that their sacrifice had broken something in the spiritual atmosphere of France, that political opposition and military pressure had failed to break, that 16 women singing on their way to the guillotine had accomplished what armies and assemblies could not. Whether that is divine intervention or historical coincidence is a question that cannot be answered by the methods historians use. What can be said is this: the timeline is exact. 10 days separated the last falling blade at the Place du Trône Renversé from the arrest of the man who had built and maintained the machinery that blade belonged to. In the entire history of the Terror, no 10-day period was more consequential. The 3 Carmelite sisters who had escaped arrest survived the revolution and lived into the 19th century. One of them, Marie Dufour, wrote a detailed first-hand account of the community's story, their years in hiding, the arrests, the days in the conciergerie, the executions as she had been told of them by witnesses, and published it in 1836. The account circulated through Catholic Europe with the momentum that attaches to stories that feel, from the first reading, like they are more than stories. In 1906, Pope Pius X beatified all 16 martyrs, formally recognizing them as the first victims of the French Revolution to be officially acknowledged by the Church. Their feast day was fixed as July 17th, the date of their execution. On December 18, 2024, 230 years after 16 women sang their way through the streets of Paris to a scaffold, Pope Francis declared them saints. The process used was equivalent canonization, reserved for martyrdoms so thoroughly documented, so continuously venerated across so many generations, that formal investigative proceedings become unnecessary. The evidence, in other words, had always been sufficient. It had simply taken the Church 2 centuries to complete the paperwork. The Place du Trône Renversé is now called the Place de la Nation. The mass graves where the 1,306 victims of that location were buried lie beneath a nearby church called the Church of the Madeleine of the city of Paris, in the 12th arrondissement. The names of all 1,306 people guillotined at that location are inscribed on marble plaques covering the walls of the crypt. You can go and read them. You can find the 16 names there among the 1,300. Parisians walk through the Place de la Nation every day. They take the metro beneath it. They buy things in the shops around it. They live their ordinary lives on ground that holds 1,300 dead, including 16 women in brown wool robes, who once stood in a line before a scaffold and asked each other one by one for permission to die, and received it, and climbed the stairs singing. The revolution promised liberty, equality, and fraternity. In its most terrible hour, it was 16 cloistered nuns who demonstrated what it actually looks like when a person refuses to let the state define the limits of their conscience. That is the kind of history that History Digger exists to tell, the stories that fall between the textbook paragraphs, the human details that explain why any of it mattered. If that's what you're looking for, subscribe. There is a great deal more of it waiting for you.